Hi, everyone. Welcome back from our truncated break. And we're going to go right into our next session on remote production. So, here to introduce his panel, once again, is TV News Check contributing editor, Glenn Dixon. Glenn?
Good afternoon and welcome to Remote Production from Exception to Option. I'm Glenn Dixon. It's been over 9 months since the COVID-19 pandemic turned our world upside down and forced broadcasters to abandon their facilities. Today, we're going to take a look at how news operations met the challenge with new remote production techniques and how they are refining those workflows for the long term as they seek new efficiency and flexibility in their operations. Joining me today are Tom Casey, VP of Technology for Meredith Local Media Group, Eric Neal, Director of IT Infrastructure and Security for Hubbard Broadcasting, Ray Thurber, CTO for EW Scripps, and Craig Wilson, Product Evangelist, Broadcast and Media Enterprise Marketing Solutions for Avid. For the audience, we'd like to make this experience as interactive as possible. So please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our panelists, which we'll address towards the end of the session. I guess I'd start with Ray. When you look across your operations, what percentage of your employees are now working in the facility versus those working remotely from home? And how does that compare to the early days of COVID-19 lockdowns? And also, how do you see that changing over the next 2 years?
Sure. Maybe not in a percentage, but let's take an average building could hold 150 people. Kind of across the group right now, we may have somewhere between 9 and 12 people in that building per shift. So that's pretty typical across the group. That would include news employees, maybe a maintenance person, and anchors. As far as how is it different now than it was, say, in late February and March, we really stayed in that environment throughout the whole pandemic. There were a couple of reasons. First and foremost, our CEO and our president, Brian Lawler, made sure that we took care of the health of our employees first. And also, as things unfolded and states kind of loosened up, we were really concerned about people kind of going back out into the world, and an increase in testing would have more cases. And as mentioned before, we're worried about the health of our people, but also quarantines are a threat to your business continuity and being able to carry on the mission of journalism. So we stayed pat. And we also stayed pat in our staffing because we had employees that have childcare issues. Maybe they have seniors moving back into their homes. And so, I've worked with people on Zoom calls inside of our company that are taking care of the business of Scripps, but also taking care of fifth grade math. So we were trying to take everything into consideration as it addresses our employees. As far as the next 2 years, we want to get back together. I love working in a newsroom, and I think most people who work with Scripps do too. The adrenaline that goes through a newsroom is hard to duplicate at home. Also, the adrenaline in a control room. So we'll be very cautious as we go back. We're really hopeful with the vaccine. We want to work together again, but we're going to keep those pillars in mind of making sure we keep our employees healthy, our business continuity, and just being very strategic how we kind of unfold everything.
Okay, thanks. Tom, what's been your experience at Meredith? How have you managed it?
Well, much like Ray, I mean, our staffing levels, just roughly as a percentage, I would say maybe 10, 15 at the most. And that was probably, at some of the locations where resources were a challenge to get stuff out of the building quickly. Our highest priority, just like Ray said, is our employee safety. Taking care of that becomes first and foremost, and then dealing with the secondary issues, whether it be childcare, family members living in a household, create challenges there. those were the key focuses. I mean, we got everybody out very quickly at the beginning of it. As things started to look better through the summer, we looked at bringing some people back in, started that, but quickly reversed course as things, like Ray was saying, as people started to become out and about and the case counts started to come back up, it became really evident that that wasn't the right place to go. So we're back right about where we were at the beginning of the pandemic. We're in hopes, just like Ray, that as the virus hits the streets and things start to become under control, we really want to put people back together in the newsrooms to be able to take advantage of the synergies that happen there. I mean, there's nothing better than watching a great team in the newsroom when a good story breaks out, and the energy that happens and their reaction and the product that comes out of it. And I don't think you can replicate that in a teleconference.
Okay, thank you. And Eric, what has the experience been like at Hubbard? Has it been much change since the spring? How many folks do you have on premise?
Yeah, our organization is going to be a little bit different from my peers here, in that we're a bunch of stations that are heavily market managed and unique culturally by location. So the answers are kind of vary depending upon which location you're looking at. Our corporate facilities where my team lives happen to be in the same building as our primary major market station. So we have some good visibility and interaction at that level with the KSTP team here in St. Paul. But the organization's ownership is very focused on health first, and that has been that way since day one. Our systems differ by each facility. While we share common front office computing, our engineering and our automation systems and our workflows vary heavily. So it's a situation where here in our St. Paul facilities, where we've seen pre-pandemic, I'd say 50% of our team was in the field most of the time. 100% of our operations, our air production staff were on site. Since the pandemic, it's come in waves. Early on, we were heavily focused on keeping people out of the buildings. As time and comfort and precautions have been put in play, and better understanding what we're dealing with, some of the facilities have seen more staff coming back in and out. Today, we're probably running about 30% of our team is in the building. And some of that's technology related. A lot of our on-air systems, we produce a lot of on-air product, especially here in Minneapolis. And you have to have people, unfortunately, at the wheels of the controls. So moving forward, the organization isn't going to be aggressive about trying to get people back in, but culturally, they really they feel it's important to the news building experience, the team to have direct interaction. So they'll be looking forward to opportunities to start ramping up again and having people in the buildings.
Okay, thank you. And Craig, can you talk a little about the the impact that COVID-19 has had on Avid's business and how it's changed the way customers use your technology?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing that happened, of course, is the not traveling. I'm someone who was used to traveling almost every week with my work, and obviously that very much Avid took a view back in March, pretty much, that globally we wouldn't travel at that point unless circumstances allowed us to do so. So I think the last time I was away for work was about the sort of middle of March, and I've been working from home like most everybody else since then. What it's really meant in terms of how people use the technology is, of course, there was then a huge shift of enabling remote access to systems that are obviously on premise in the studio facility that's there. So what we saw was a big uptake in workflows that existed before, but perhaps hadn't been used so much, where you could access some of our systems, like our newsroom system, iNews, Media Central, accessing them remotely and trying to give users the same sort of technical experience whether you're working inside the building or outside of the building itself. So giving people access to the material so they could, write their stories and even edit their stories and do that remotely, but then get material back to the main site for it to go on air. And I think that's something that we've obviously seen continue. The one thing which the other panelists have all talked about is the creative challenge, if you like, of working in distributed teams, and it's very difficult to sort of recreate that. I guess that sense of community that you have in a newsroom where you're kind of working together to a common goal. And as we speak to customers, I think they are still cautious about bringing staff back into the building, and so we want to continue to take advantage of some of the workflows that have been enabled through the course of this. And I think as we begin to move forward, I think people will also want to assess how have these individual workflows worked? What's the best of things that perhaps we want to use? I was speaking to a news director earlier this week who was talking about the fact of they're now doing some of their conferences and they're doing them over Zoom and Teams rather than bringing people together in the building. And he said that actually means that people can maybe stay at home for an extra hour in the morning. So perhaps from a work-life balance perspective, there's certain things like that I think customers may want to continue to take advantage of, even as hopefully we go through next year and the situation returns a little bit more like normal. And I think the other thing to point out is that, of course, people already have studio facilities. They have invested in equipment that's in their server room. Perhaps it's virtualized, but it's still there. And of course, they want to make the best utilization of that as they can. And so really it's at this point, it's been about remote access into those systems to enable customers to stay on air and continue to do the really important job of delivering the news to the audience in the markets that they're in.
Okay, thanks. All these remote production workflows hinge on IP connectivity. That's what it's all based on. And so I want to start with Tom. Have you found at Meredith, have you been able to rely on employees' existing home broadband connections to support these workflows? Particularly when we're talking about anchors going live from their living rooms or basements, or have you had to upgrade them? And then on the other end of it, have you done anything to modify the IP connectivity at the stations?
So yeah, and we chatted about this a little bit last week. It was interesting to find out early on in this process that you just make the assumption that everybody's got a good internet connection at their house because they work in the technology world and they're surrounded by it. So why wouldn't they? But when we found out that there were a handful of people that didn't have any internet access at their house and they just relied solely on their handheld device for everything they did, we had to scramble pretty quickly to mitigate that problem. But for the most part, the people that did have internet access available and the broadband connectivity was sufficient for everything that we needed to do. Interestingly enough, on the station side, though, we had a software-defined WAN project that had just started to get underway as all of this unfolded, and it kind of got put on the shelf by our corporate IT team. We had to reverse course there as we needed that connectivity and get that turned up. And I tell you, it's really been a lifesaver since we've completed the project, and the access has been improved considerably. But the big challenge at the beginning of that was actually getting vendors to be able to come on site to complete the installation of the circuits that we needed in some of the cities. But once we got over that hurdle, it was definitely a marked improvement in things.
Okay, thank you. And Eric, at Hubbard, what's been your experience, with employees, connectivity, and do you do anything special at the stations to try to improve the overall IP path?
Yeah, our station connectivity has been fairly well engineered. We're typically 70% over what we typically need during worst case scenarios. So none of our buildings really have run into any headaches in that regard. On the home front, we've seen a handful of things occur. More often than not, it hasn't been that somebody's got an inadequate broadband at home. It's that they've got too many kids on their PlayStations or competing for the same bandwidth because they're doing remote schooling or whatever. So we found ourselves having to consult with folks about their home internet, hygiene, if you will, and trying to make sure that they're planning for, if they need it for live broadcast or what have you, that they're working with their family to make sure that they're not competing for connectivity. In scenarios where we've had critical staff, especially on our personalities, where we've struggled with broadband or internet connectivity, our LiveU packs have been lifesavers. We've got the opportunity to go into homes with devices that will, combine multiple G4 or G5 if you're lucky enough. Mobile circuits has been a lifesaver in a handful of cases. So it's kind of a combination of all those efforts.
Okay, thanks. And Ray, what has Scripps' experience been? Have you had to upgrade the connectivity at any of your employees' homes or do anything on the station side?
Yeah, I think we're a little bit more like Tom, where the issues that we've had are few and far between. So our employees have been great. It really hasn't been an issue. We've kind of joked internally that maybe we just hired video gamers and didn't know it, but their bandwidth connectivity has been solid. As we were kind of relocating out of our buildings, our partners at Scripps IT were adding in local VPNs so that we didn't all drive through like 1 or 2 VPN systems. That made a big difference as far as speed. But generally speaking, our circuits have been adequate. Our employees at home have been fine, and those VPNs definitely help.
Okay, thanks. Interesting the fact that you had people, the fact that Tom mentioned that you had some people who didn't even have broadband at home. At least you're getting younger employees. If the people are relying on their smartphones, then you have the right generation coming to your workforce. Are you using? I guess I'll go back to Ray with this, and then to the other panelists. Are you using cloud solutions today for editing and graphics, or are you more relying on that kind of remote access that Craig mentioned? Just getting at the on-premise hardware at your stations.
Yeah, I might answer yes. So we have cloud when it makes sense, like content sharing across our group. We use remote access to systems that are still in the building using tools like Splashtop, which has been awesome. And then we have certain stations, and they all share best practices, but certain stations that just are comfortable doing FTP because typically in a news environment, you're dealing with smaller files. So it hasn't been an issue, especially with the bandwidth we have. So a little bit of everything, Glenn.
And were you using any cloud-based editing before the pandemic? Was that something you've been experimenting with, just looking ahead, or?
Not so much cloud-based editing, but cloud-based content sharing with systems like Squarebox's CatDV. So we would use that, and there's logging capabilities in there. But for the most part, the way that we've kind of worked in the pandemic has been through remote control of systems or FTP.
Okay, thanks. And Tom, how about in Meredith? Any new adoption of cloud solutions for editing or graphics, or?
Not so much cloud. I mean, kind of like Ray says, and a lot of it's due to the varying skill sets and the resources available in the stations. We kind of stuck with the remote access of existing systems on premise. We have a pretty good size footprint of equipment that came with RGS licensing by birth. So we capitalized on that, and that seemed to be a pretty consistent, user-friendly, reliable workflow that once they started using it, they just really never looked back. I mean, our field editing environment and remote contribution, that was already pretty well in place. So not much of that changed. It was mostly driven around access into the footprint of the building from remote.
And was that something that you had played around with before COVID for, people working on weekends or breaking news when you're short-staffed?
A little bit, but not to the extent. And I tell you honestly, because of, we have some facilities on the publishing side and our People TV show operation. in New York, they use some of these resources. So, you know, to look over the fence a little bit and take some stuff out of their toolbox, I think was another thing that helped us out. I mean, they were already using Bebop, some other tools like that, you know, we just grabbed a hold of and threw into our toolbox on the local media group side, and it helped get things off the ground quickly.
Okay, thanks. And Eric, at Hubbard, how much have you guys used cloud-based editing or some of these remote desktop access systems to get at on-premise editing and graphics hardware?
Yeah, most of our shops were either fresh into new automation platforms and new NLE technology, having transitioned from one platform to another in the few months leading up to the pandemic, or scenarios like our major market station here in St. Paul was Final Cut based, and there aren't a lot of tools that are geared at cloud-based editing, unfortunately. We primarily expanded our VPN access into our facilities to put out a lot more secure ID dongles and got people upgraded to access from home, and that's been our primary shift.
Okay, thanks. You know, Craig, you talked before about you know, the big focus was on getting employees remote access to equipment they already had on premise. You know, I guess did a webinar prior to this one, kind of looking at the overall question of moving news workflows to the cloud. You know, when you look Avid today, how much are your customers using the cloud today for news production, and where do you see that going in a couple of years? I know you have had some development because of COVID, but yeah, can you speak to that shift overall?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as the other guys have said, in the short term, it's been very much about remote access, and I think both Ray and Tom talked about this, about using cloud where it's appropriate, and I think there's still a big focus on that. So there's a couple of things. I mean, we've had an early access program to what's called Edit on Demand. It's aimed a little bit more at the sort of post market, but that basically is an entire solution, including storage and editors, you know, working in a cloud-based environment. And you know, the feedback from customers who have been using it is that, you know, the editors themselves can't tell the difference if the edit machine is in the cloud or if it's actually sitting on a machine under the desk. But there are a whole range of different options. I think, you know, one thing that we're probably still going to have is, you know, most people are still going to have some kind of studio facility. So you're going to have and still want to have facilities in those studios themselves, whether that's for, you know, ingest or play out or graphics and things like that. But you may want to host certain services or even potentially storage and use that in the cloud. And then there's some questions around, you know, obviously getting media into the cloud and then out of the cloud as well. So I think what we are obviously looking at as we, you know, head into 2021 and on is really enabling customers wherever they are in that particular journey, whether it's moving from bare metal to virtualization in your own server room, or going to a data center, or exploring cloud-based options. I think we see across the globe really of customers that we deal with that range of options being available. And I think most people, as they look perhaps at their next technology refresh, would look into probably that kind of hybrid environment where you've got facilities on premise, but you have options in the cloud as well. In terms of what we have at the moment with our Media Central products, you know, we're already using some cloud hosted services for things like AI and for things like publishing to social media platforms and things like that as well. So it's certainly a journey that's continuing on. I think within the company, there is a very big focus, as you can imagine. The focus back in January on cloud workflows to the focus now within the industry, I think is significantly different. Because I think a few years ago, people who were pretty bullish about cloud, I think things had slowed down a little bit in the last couple of years. But because of what's happened this year, there is a huge renewed focus within the industry of looking at what is practical, realistic. I think also some other things, you know, people are maybe more willing at looking at things like subscription models now. And of course, subscription models come with, you know, cloud-based workflows as well. So there's a whole range of things that are kind of going on at the moment. And to come back to something I said earlier on, the focus very much just now has been about remote access to existing facilities. I think when it comes to that next technology refresh, I think that's when lots of different options are going to be explored, and about utilizing the capabilities of the cloud where it's most appropriate for the customers.
Just to follow up, Craig, do you see any big, your portfolio is global. Do you see any big differences in mindset about using the cloud for news production between North America and maybe Abbott's customers in Europe or Asia?
I think one of the challenges that certain regions have is about access to certain cloud facilities. Latency is something that you have to take into consideration. And if you have large latencies, if you're not particularly close to a data center, now this isn't so much an issue in say North America or Europe, but it is in other parts of the world. Then that's clearly something that you have to take into consideration. So I definitely think that a number of customers that we're speaking to now, they are perhaps adopting a sort of cloud first strategy that perhaps they weren't adopting a little while before. But equally, I think it's important that you're able to provide to them the value of why you want to do that. Because I think if you simply take your existing workflows and put them into the cloud, you're probably not going to get the kind of advantages that you actually potentially could get from a cloud-based deployment. So I think it does require a little bit of rethinking about what is it that you actually want to do and how is that then best achieved. So I think within the different regions, I think people have had a lot of learning in the course of this year. And they're looking at things like cloud, certainly for disaster recovery. They're looking for sharing of content, for example, particularly sharing of content, potentially putting facilities which are on different countries, different continents. But that's not quite the same as saying, I want to take everything I do at the moment and I want to put it in a cloud-based environment, because again, to go back to something I said earlier on, you're still going to have these edge devices that you need to have, connected to it as well. So there's still, a huge amount of interest, more interest than there was, I guess, at this point last year, but very much focused on what's appropriate for me, where can I get the advantages, what are the economies that I can get from this, as opposed to just taking what I do today and putting it in a cloud environment.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and I think that overall, we'll probably explore the willingness to invest in cloud technology in general, and maybe a little later in the session. But one of the things I wanted to, a near-term thing I wanted to talk about was monitoring and communications from the stations. Talking to some of my reporting and some other webinars, most people said, getting feeds out from talent's homes hasn't been a challenge. You're utilizing the same bonded cellular systems that people have been using for years. Maybe you're hooking them up to, hardline broadband links versus using them on the cellular networks. But that the return feeds sometimes is challenging. Being able to monitor, maybe in examples like weathercasters who are trying to do that from home. Being able to do confidence monitoring and queuing through an IP link back. Ray, can you talk a little bit about how Scripps has managed that, and have you invested in any new technology for remote monitoring and back channel communications? Things like intercom.
Sure. We had a lot of unity in the group and we really liked that. So stations leveraged that. And the Scripps DOEs have been really good about best practices sharing and awesome. So we had great ideas pop up with things like Axis encoders, which are very inexpensive encoders that people use in the security. And we would take a print of a control room monitor and send it home that way. So really that coupled with Teams or Zooms on just getting those monitor walls into people's homes. And then the intercom systems that we've already had, it's allowed us to direct from home, produce from home, and it's worked pretty darn well.
Okay, thanks. Tom, what has Meredith's experience been with the return feed challenge and monitoring?
Yeah, I don't think we're not in any different boat than anybody else is in the group, but the most interesting thing was, like Ray was talking about, getting your hands on those encoders. at the beginning of this whole process, they just evaporated. They were gone. It was like they were non-existent when you wanted to go order some. We had really regular calls with all the DOEs though, and shared best practices. There was a litany of things in the toolbox, from Blackmagic converters to standalone encoders to Zoom meetings and all of the various teleconferencing platforms that were available for use along the way. And we've kind of put together, a toolbox full of those. In addition to that, our bonded cellular provider and the return video functionality that came along with that, we ramped that up pretty quickly as well. And that's probably been one of the best resources that we were able to take advantage of is the feature set that came along with their products.
Okay, thank you. Eric, doing anything new on the monitoring or intercom side, since COVID-19 happened?
Not enough. There's been an explosion of homegrown toolkits, if you will, across the organization. Shoestring and bubblegum everywhere. We don't have a corporate standard solution on the video side especially, but a lot of creative solutions have come out of production and operations in all of our buildings, and a whole lot of AirPods and iPhones, where we here we've got a lot of IFB dial-in solutions that have really ramped up in use for monitoring stuff during live broadcasts and what have you. So a little bit of everything. Moving forward, we have our eyes very definitely on some NDI-based technology for remote contribution into the cloud and generating remote monitoring solutions that we're looking forward to, but the dust has got to settle a little bit before we start looking at investing.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it does seem like of the various functions that are necessary to producing a newscast, the group seem to have innovated more on this issue almost than anything else. The range of applications or kind of jury-rigged systems that people have set up for monitoring, is always strikes me as interesting when I've been reporting on this. And people have made heavy use of basically consumer video conferences, things like Zoom or WebEx, and then figuring out a way to provide that to people in the field on an iPad or an iPhone to make it work. I want to follow up with you, Eric, because you're in the IT side of the house for Hubbard. How much of a challenge is security with these new, remote workflows and sort of long term, if this, if some part of this becomes permanent with a good chunk of the workforce staying home at least maybe a couple days a week, and using their home internet networks and maybe home computers for work purposes on a long-term basis. How do you approach that, and where do you think things stand today?
On paper, at 50,000 feet, everything looks pretty rosy. Our organization, from a policy standpoint, has been VPN, pre and post pandemic here. But the reality of things is as people have been making ends meet, they've been adopting solutions, that have skirted policy, and instead of breaking things, we're working with them to address the problems and pull them back inside of best practices. So we're focused on VPN for remote networks in most cases. We have some Bebop and we have some some team viewers type stuff happening here and there that we prefer not to, but it is what it is for the moment. Workstations and home, a lot of the edit technology that was 100% on-prem prior to pandemic, and then some of it started getting distributed, wasn't geared for front office computing. So we've had to carefully try to triage taking an NLE kit for use at home and as it leaves the building, and trying to make sure that it's properly locked down and it's got some monitoring tools on it for both patching and and for secure VPN and remote management. That's been a little bit challenging and varying levels of success across the organization, but that's a big focus. And then mobile, we had a pretty big contingency of reporters and photogs that were equipped already with laptop mobile-based NLE solutions, and that's seemingly worked well. We were well equipped for remote for most of our news production people, or reporters and producers, in terms of the newsroom workflows types of stuff, and it's just a matter of expanding on those same things, and it's worked out pretty well.
Okay, thanks. Tom, how big of a concern do you see security being? And, if this becomes more a permanent way of life, do you see making any changes in how you manage it?
Oh yeah, security is one of those things that keeps me up at night, but just like everybody else, that went out the window immediately at the first round. But then we quickly scrambled to kind of go back and tighten up the holes and cover things. And I tell you, our corporate IT team has done an outstanding job of supporting us in that area. As the different teleconferencing platforms, whether it's Zoom or, any of those, to incorporate single sign-on and get things kind of bolted back together from a security standpoint. The other place where there was a little bit of an issue, as machines went outside the building, is being able to make sure that updates are being pushed on them, that they're getting all of the security patches and the things that they need. So, we had to make some adjustments to our deployment platform for those tools to be able to reach those machines outside of our environment. There's some changes like that. One of the big things that we do is we use a lot of Citrix. I mean, Citrix is kind of a lifesaver to keep things safe, because the other side of it is, once these people go outside the building, they can't jump through 20 steps to get to the resources that they need. So a big part of it is trying to make it user friendly and the experience palatable for the people that are working out in the field, and not be too burdensome.
Okay, thanks. Ray, have you done anything new to manage security as you've shifted to so much remote production?
I don't know if I call it new, because we've always been tight with Scripps IT Security, had a great relationship. They're on every engineering call we have. So as the pandemic kind of started, they were in the room always, and then flexed with us as we rushed to get people out. And then we made sure that everything was secure with them. Kind of what Tom said too, the updates are regular. And then as we can see ways for us to refine our workflow, they're in the room and helping us. So I wouldn't call it new necessarily, Glenn. It was just kind of a continuation of what we had always done, because as Tom mentions, you worry about security pre-pandemic. And that was always a discussion. So it's just more of that relationship kind of deepening as IT and engineering continue to blend.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Craig, what's your take on the security issue? And is Avid doing anything new on the security front, with things like cloud editing? I know, talking to a local station, that they talked about, they were moving around footage from one of the particular sports leagues. They had, that was going over to public internet. Even if they were just doing it between employees' homes for editing purposes, they had to make sure it was encrypted, because they wouldn't be honoring their agreements otherwise. So yeah, anything new that's come up on the security front because of the shift in workflow?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of things have happened. I think one is, I think in the past, broadcast engineering and IT had some creative differences, let's put it that way. But I think they're now, working much more closely together to enable a lot of the workflows that the other guys have talked about here. So while VPN, I think, is still, sort of fundamentally the main technology that people use at the moment, people are very interested in VPN-less technologies. They're looking at things like zero trust. And how that can be enabled to ensure you still have a secure connection. They're also looking at things like multi-factor authentication as well as part of that. In terms of things around streaming, then yes, I mean, I think we are seeing again, economics driving this partly as well, a way of doing streaming using encrypted technologies to then get material into their system, But then really what customers want is once the media comes in, they want that user experience really from that point to be the same. So if I'm a user, does it really matter if this is something that's coming into me as a stream or it's something that's coming in as an SDI feed traditionally? So, we are obviously, investigating at the moment the ways of bringing that in, but then having that same user experience at the other end where the media comes in, it's in a house format, standardized, and can then go out. Because I think the other thing to pick up on what you said there was the range of devices that can potentially send material in, whether that's user generated content, whether it's something I'm doing off my phone, or it's something where you're using some kind of encoder to then put the stream in, then I think we're going to see an increased use of those kind of technologies as well. So building on the kind of live view packs that the guys have talked about as well. So I think we're going to see more of that. But security will always be a real kind of primary objective for us because it's such an important factor for all our customers. And continuing to deliver secure solutions, whether that's through encryption or the other kinds of technologies that I've described, is very much a focus for us as we can head into next year. Avid, as you know, we don't just work in the news environment, but we do a lot of work in feature film environments, a lot of work with the large studios, and as you can imagine, there is a huge focus on security there. So we very much work very closely with them and industry bodies around delivering new security solutions as well.
Okay, thanks. This question occurs to me as particularly appropriate since I was shoveling snow for a couple hours this morning. But as you head into, I guess, the second winter of the pandemic, how are you managing field crews? As I'll throw that question to Ray. You have a mix of sort of extremes in weather across your group, but how do you manage field crews in the winter? Now that you can't use the van as safe haven for a couple staffers, is there anything different that you're doing? And maybe you can talk about what you did this summer in some of your warmer markets.
Yeah, Glenn, we have stations in Phoenix, so it got hot there in the summer and kind of a prelude to what's happening in the winter. We set up in certain markets like Detroit and Indianapolis where it can get cold. They'd utilize their garage, and maybe those tents that you would see at an art fair, several of those in a garage appropriately spaced with their own heaters. It's just kind of shelter if they want to come in and have a place they can edit. Currently, our field crews, and it's been since late February, early March, they stay out of our stations. They're in the field, and that's where they work. They also drive separate vehicles. So if Glenn, you and I were working together, we would each have a vehicle. So those locations inside of kind of outbuildings in our environments, or maybe just a portion like a lobby where no one else is there because no one goes into our buildings, that we can keep it secure for them. We do that. We've also used vehicles, larger vehicles, maybe production facilities that we're not using right now. We can plug them in, get them the internet, pull them up next to the building and have them use that.
Okay, thanks. And just like maintaining maximum spacing within those vehicles, like the sports guys have been doing, screens and in between and that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. We actually prefer one at a time. So it's maybe I'm in there in this production facility using it, and then I clean it, leave, and it's available for the next person.
Okay, thank you. Eric, doing anything different with field crews at Hubbard because of COVID-19? And I guess in particular, how do you manage, covering in winter weather in markets like Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Yeah, I can't speak to operations directly, but I do know that they're working within the guidelines issued by the organization, and I think there's a lot more personal mileage being paid out and the like. So it's probably similar to any of the other operations here.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Are you doing anything new across Meredith with your field operations?
No, very similar to everybody else. They're all out of the building. We've some areas with everybody else out in the sales areas and the second floor, some locations staged up, a facility that they can come in from the outside and do some editing, and they're isolated from everybody else, and they're cleaned between entries of employees. Dragging some old vehicles out of retirement, just like Ray was saying, satellite trucks, production trucks that get pressed into service as a tool for that. Some tents, some garages, all the same stuff. The main thing is the handoff of equipment and how we deal with all of that aspect. I mean, I think it's pretty common what everybody's doing as far as keeping them in separate vehicles and all of that kind of stuff. But cleaning of the equipment, making sure that they're well stocked with cleaning supplies and PPE in their vehicles. Some of that kind of stuff becomes a very high priority.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it is kind of amazing the number of things that we do automatically today as normal daily functions, which we never had to worry about before, like never leaving the house without hand sanitizer, that kind of thing, or your mask. Ray, you talked before about the desire to bring people back to the newsrooms and how to have people come back and collaborate in person. With so many people working though in these just distributed locations for at least the near future, and it does seem like there'll be some lasting effect from this across groups with people maybe working from home a day or two a week where they were in the office 5 days before. How do you maintain that culture of collaboration if you are in this remote workflow for a long time? I know everyone's talked about using Zoom and web. Is that enough? Is that, is there anything else that you're looking at that, and maybe even stuff on a non-technical side, is there anything you do as a manager to kind of keep up the newsroom culture, even though everyone's apart?
Yeah, I think the newsroom has been very good with their morning meetings of doing Zoom calls. And even before the pandemic, newsrooms were really gravitating to tools like Slack and Teams, which they describe themselves as kind of their collective brain, where it's just an ongoing conversation throughout the day to keep them connected. We have been gravitating and working very hard on a scripts tool for assignments and crew assignments especially. And that is the one source of truth, we call it, on a story where it's birthed, and it updates all the critical systems around it in our newsroom. So we think that's very key, and that rollout continues. But these tools like Slack and Teams and Zoom, that really has kept them connected and collaborating throughout the day.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and Tom, is there anything else you see that you can do for collaboration to try to, keep that newsroom feel, and also, keep the adrenaline of the control room that I believe you spoke about? I think it was Ray, but
the newsroom is key, honestly. I mean, the control room, because we're automated, there's typically in most environments there's a producer and a director in the control room. So that really doesn't exist so much as it used to in the old days. I do think though the collaboration in the newsroom is going to be an ongoing challenge. The same tools that Ray's using, we're using. I mean, Slack moved pretty quickly in our environment from an IT kind of tool or an engineering tool to a news collaboration tool. And they've already been doing some of the editorial meetings remotely. Those continue, and they're fully remote now in Zoom meetings or WebExes. So I don't see that changing much. It's just as company leaders, it's pretty commonplace for us to be participating in these prior to the pandemic, but to push this group of people in it that hasn't had to operate that way has been a struggle. I mean, they've adopted it well in most environments, but you don't get that same fury that goes on in the newsroom when something happens without a group of people in there as a team working together.
Okay, thanks. And we've come up close to the wrap. Any Any final thoughts as we head into 2021? Craig, anything new on the collaboration side? I mean, from Avid's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, delivering on collaboration, team collaboration is something that obviously within an Avid environment, sharing of content is something that we've obviously been doing for a long time, but we are delivering new collaboration tools in our Media Central platform around things like assignments and planning and tasking people to do stuff. I think one final thing I'd say, because I'm conscious of time, is as someone who was a news producer in my previous life before I joined Avid, in terms of collaboration, there was very few things that were as effective as shouting to somebody else across a newsroom. And it's very hard to replicate that in an IT environment. So yeah, continuing to deliver more collaboration tools, but I completely agree with what everyone else has said about that. In-person experience is very difficult to replicate.
Okay, well, thanks. Hopefully people will be back to more in-person experiences at some point in 2021. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time, thank the audience for their attention, and hand it back over to Michael Depp.
Thank you. Thanks to the panelists and Glenn for that last discussion.